Great.
And then if you just want to full screen the picture, and then
Ready to go?
just let him know when you want him to.
Wow. Sorry. Emily?
Yeah.
Come here. How do I full screen
Like this?
this? Oh. Okay.
Great, thanks. Well, another good introduction was actually Brittany's presentation, because what I'm fascinated by is how do we turn experience into knowledge? That's really been my question for years, and so how does this experience of a place, experiences that you have as a person, turn into artwork? How does that become words? What's this magical process that goes on? So similarly in science, how do we know by looking at the environment or looking at a plant or looking at human beings, medicine, really anything that we study, how does that become knowledge? We have some sort of experience that turns into what we think of as knowledge or a concept or things that people didn't study. And so now we know this. How does that process really happen? And so my thesis was to use a sense-based approach rather than a more strictly conceptual way of working. So I'll talk a little bit of why that is. But this really comes out of our sense of nature, our sense of how do we learn things educationally or just as people all the time. So a lot of the work stems from Husserl's work, who's a phenomenological philosopher. He actually started as a scientist and became this well-known philosopher in phenomenology. And so he's writing about a great title, The Crisis of European Sciences and Phenomenology. Because there's a crisis there. He saw this almost 100 years ago, as did Rudolf Steiner, other thinkers. And they were starting to say, you know, there's some problem, and it's not just the physical things that are happening. The problem is really in our thinking. Because we're thinking in this concept way, which is really dividing everything up and then sticking with some concept that someone has arrived at some point in history, rather than what's actually our experience. So nature really is this physical thing that we're encountering with our sensory apparatus or apparati, and how do we do that? So I formed a thesis as a methodology. It's an applied thesis to actually create certain bits of visual phenomena that we can actually look at. And then how does that become knowledge in some sort? And how do we make sense of it? And make sense of it by looking at various aspects of visual phenomena. So I looked at, and I divided this into 4 different levels in my thinking. And then I'm trying to see, can I understand something by this division and something by what we see in each of these different levels. So kind of the first level is just black and white, because all of light phenomena really rest on this aspect of lightness and darkness. Just driving up here from Phoenix this morning at 6 o'clock, and you can see nothing in the sky because it's black. And then as the sun starts to come up, I can start to see these really dark clouds. And I can't distinguish anything, but I can see that they're lighter. It's no longer just blackness. It's this bit of grayness. So in something like this, you can see because of this interaction of light and dark, we start to make sense of this. It's not a clear object. It's not naturalistic. It's not realistic. But we could start to see, well, there's certain areas that are light, some are dark, some are lighter and darker, and then in grays you start to see, well, there's something here. So our minds might turn this into a landscape. Oh yeah, it's a very clear mountain range to some people, and other people are going to see it and go, can't make heads or tails of it. So how do we turn that into something? So we're interacting with this, we're starting to differentiate, and everyone can see that has their sense of sight is working. They can see this as, they can differentiate between parts of this. Is this part darker for everyone in here? Everyone would probably agree and say yes. Is everyone seeing this as white? Yes. And then some shades of gray. So we can just go down through and see a few other. then something like this starts to become a little bit more like what we would turn into maybe a story in our heads. I can start to make sense of this in a different way. And it's no longer just light and dark, but oh, maybe these are trees. Maybe this is a reflection. I noticed this gray area is different than this. Our minds are constantly doing that. We're constantly turning our experience, this visual experience, into a story to make sense of it. How do we come to meaning? What can I know here? So, of course, I'm implanting these ideas when I say, oh, maybe it's a landscape, maybe it's trees. Your experience may have been completely something different. You might have looked at this and said, oh, it's sideways, or it's upside down. All of those aspects could be there in what we're seeing visually. How do we make sense of that? Then something like this with dark on light starts to become, oh, this seems a little more clearly a landscape. Maybe there's mountains, maybe that's a river, maybe that's a night sky. In any case, it's still just this quantity. I can really kind of quantify this just lighter, darker. This is kind of the first level of looking at things. Whereas if you contrast it with this, now with color, I can look at lighter and darker and still say, oh, maybe this is a darker area here, and so on. But this is really a different level of experience because it includes this color aspect. Our experience of color is very different. And part of what's going on here as well is there's now an interaction between the colors because this blue is the same as this blue over here, but it appears to us to be very different. And some of this is the work of Albers, Joseph Albers, who was artist and writer, and he wrote about this. He has a great book called Interaction of Colors. And so he did all sorts of experiments with color to show how that works. You can make something appear very different by what's around it. So it's not our visual apparatus and our understanding of what we see visually is not just based on our eyes and not even just based on our brains, but it's really how do we process that? How do we have to really include our experience in that. And so Cézanne and, of course, the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists started to really work with that. How do we actually see things and these color interactions? So red and green, or how does yellow and red work together? And this is a short sketch, a brief sketch, because it doesn't really do certain things that need to be done. Partly like these shadows are just kind of darker or fuller areas and so on. They're not really showing how color interacts, but you do get at least some light and dark in there. I was only wanting to show a few things and not have a full realistic rendering. Well, if we could go on a little bit further before we get to this. Yeah, so here's another black and white. It's now a photograph. And this one, because of the interaction of light and dark, we can start to make sense of this plant and where it is, how close it is. We can start to see, oh, there's a background, a foreground. We can make sense of everything just in terms of light and dark again. So I'd done a series of these, some which were much whiter, and so you couldn't make sense of them, and some which are much darker, so you couldn't make sense of them. So we're actually seeing all the time, it's kind of this certain area between light and dark is all that we can really perceive. Things get too dark, you can't see. Too light, you can't see either. So it's really this blending of light and dark as part of our perception. Yeah, let's go through a few more. Here's a light and dark. Oh, this one, okay. So here's the actual leaf taped right here on the wall. And this is a fall leaf. And you can see this wonderful color that's there in nature and how we actually see that. So that, a scientist could tell you about chlorophyll and xanthophylls and all these other things, but what do those really tell us about these leaves and how we really experience this leaf? So, go on. let's go back a little bit and see, yeah. So if we rendered that just in light and dark, here's what it becomes. So those certain areas that were very light, the yellowish areas, and now there's the reds, the greens that were in here, the reds, which are actually darker. Just the tone, we could start to separate those out. And this is now a new experience, which is actually what's known as an after image. So I can also look at this leaf in terms of its after image, which is, if we could find the one with those circles, the red, yeah, or green. If we could do the red first. I didn't put these in the order. Red image. Yeah.
Red image.
Thanks. Yeah. So this third level, after going light and dark, color interactions, there's a third aspect of our vision that we tend to not notice a lot, but it's what's known as an after image. Is that if you look at this, you can take a piece of paper or you can look at anything, really, if you have part of how our eyes work, our cones have to need a certain amount of light for this to really work. But if you were to look at this for a while and then look away, it takes about 30 seconds, and if you look away over here, what you'll actually see is, if we can find the other, that green one we saw earlier, the bluish green one, let's say after image, this. What you actually see is this. So this you will see if you look onto white paper after looking at the red, you actually see an after image, which is created partly by how our nervous system works, but it's also, you'll actually see this if you close your eyes. So even in darkness, we actually see color. So how is it we're able to see color or something when there's actually no light at all? But this is part of our experience. So it's part of how we interact with color phenomena in the world, how we interact with nature. And the red with green after image, the next one, yeah. So this is kind of this is being transformed into this other experience. So our experiences are always have this aspect of one thing becomes another. And so if we can do the leaf after image I was showing, which is labeled leaf after image, we look at that there. So if you looked at that leaf that we'd seen earlier, you can actually experience the leaf this way on a different level.
Did you do these?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just rendered these in pastels to say, here's what we'd actually see here's what I would see in my after image. Yeah. So a lot of this work is based on the work of Goethe from the early 1800s. So he was really investigating nature in a very different way of how we actually experience it. And he would say the theory really should come out of our experience, shouldn't be coming out of concepts gained in another way. And so Husserl is reflecting that as well, and other phenomenologists that have taken this up. So we can go to two more. Maybe a little bit more. So this prism, leaf through prism. Part of what happens if you look at light through a prism, it doesn't turn into rainbows like Newton said, because that's a very special case. So Goethe actually looked at it and said, well, actually what you see is very different. But what happens is, just by the interaction of light and dark, this fourth level is, what's going on is you'll actually see yellow and red. So here you see where the white meets the dark of the leaf. You get this nice yellow and then a reddish part here. And then when the darkness meets the light, you'll actually see a violet and this blue-green or teal, almost a turquoise at the base there. And then you'll see a little bit of green in the special circumstance where there's a little bit of light in between darkness. The yellow that's here and this greenish blue here, this blue and yellow will mix and make a green experience there. So the prism phenomena is a little bit harder to understand if you haven't worked with it, but really fascinating work is shows how light actually works and how color kind of comes from light and dark. And so that was one of Goethe's ideas and what he would call the law of nature. So part of what this work is for is to see if we can find something in the lawfulness of nature. So Goethe said what we're really looking for are higher rules and laws. So what are the rules that are found here? And so one of them is that our perception is very active. It's a part of nature. And part of the crisis that's come about in science is that we've tried to take ourselves out of nature. That's really the crisis, is that this idea that we can be objective and study this objective world apart from ourselves is really a mistake. And there are a lot of problems with it in terms of education. Teach in high school, and you see this all the time with high school students. They think the answer is out there. It's not in themselves and their interaction with the world. And actually, of course, we're in nature. We're always in nature. We're not in nature just when we go to the park or the wilderness. We're in nature all the time. We're in air. We're in other people. And so Merleau-Ponty, who worked with primacy of perception and phenomenology of perception, he was saying, we have to think about our senses very differently. Instead of the subject-object, we really need to see that our senses are really a state of consciousness. And this consciousness is constantly interacting with everything around us all the time. So instead of thinking that, oh, I'm receiving these impressions from what I see, oh, I'm hearing something that comes in physically and interacts with me, and that's why a lot of people think, oh, well, nothing exists, right? It's all vibrations in your nervous system. That's kind of that extreme. But that's really an extreme kind of separation of us from our environment, from nature. And of course, it leads to a lot of this feeling that nature is unimportant because, well, it doesn't really exist. We can't be destroying it. It's not really there. And so this newer way of phenomenological thinkers that are saying, well, we recognize that, first of all, how we actually take in the world is through these different states of consciousness, which we think of as our senses. So they're very active. They're always going on. And so what I've looked at and tried to come to conclusions about is what do we see when we look at these different levels of phenomena? So I think there's a few more slides that we can look at that might. Yeah, so something like this starts to incorporate a lot of that. And I wouldn't call it art at all, but I would say you can visually see certain things that are going on here. So, for instance, probably where your eye is drawn are certain places like this, and probably some places like this. And that's partly because what we're really seeing a lot of here is this contrast between light and dark. So what, on one level, is just this physical, quantifiable aspect of this is really light, this is really dark. In another sense, it really catches our eye. Why does this catch our eye? And this one catches our eye for a couple of reasons. One is light and dark, but it's also this color interaction. So these complementary colors of yellow and violet that arise, that's part of also the phenomena that happens in after images. So if you look at something red, you see something green in your after image. If you look at something green, you see something red. If you look at something yellow, you see violet. Violet, you see yellow. So in every case, these complementary colors arise. That's not painting theory. That is actually how our eyes work on this level of what's going on visually. Is that this is a lawfulness in nature, this complementary color phenomenon that's going on. And we're also really drawn to it in that way. So if we get another, I think there's this one, also using these same colors in a very different way, you experience it in a very different kind of light. And you notice, of course, here, a lot of this is the difference between light and dark here, or between white and yellow, is so, it's kind of at our threshold. Can we even see that? Are we even drawn to this, or our experience of this is like, just kind of go off into space? It doesn't really doesn't grab us unless it maybe pulls us out of ourselves. But Goethe's work, Rudolf Steiner, others who've really gone into this, they would say, you know, how these kind of recede, this violet, the cooler colors recede, the warmer colors kind of come out of the plane. So the Impressionists love to use that quality, give it depth, not based on realism and perspective, but just on color itself. So taking that one aspect of our experience, developing it further. But this is going on in various ways. In the prism colors, the same thing happens. Where light meets dark, you get yellows and reds. Where dark meets light, you get blues and violets. There's a separation of cools and warms. Why is that? Why are these complementary qualities always there? What is this division? How does light and dark work that way? So part of what I was coming to in this work is really seeing that light and dark are this kind of bigger polarity that then lives into color interactions on a second level, works into our after images that we're always seeing and not generally taking notice of, and working even on the level of prisms and optics, and this more advanced abstract experience still has this quality there. There's some thread that's going through these different levels of experience that we're putting together all the time. And that was, for Merleau-Ponty, he used this nice phrase, he calls it mental chemistry, is that these states of consciousness that we're dealing with all the time, kind of just this physical level of light and dark. Can I see anything? You wake up in the middle of the night, you can't see anything. Where am I? But these different levels, we're always having to do this chemistry. How do these go together? Is it light and dark? Do I experience it? It's different to have these lights off here and natural light. It's different on a sunny day. We're constantly experiencing that. So this mental chemistry is what we're doing with our states of our consciousness, which is interacting with the world all the time. So how do we do that? That's the chemistry that turns our experience, partly what it turns our experience into knowledge. And not just a conceptual knowledge, but actually sense-based experience. If we can start to think in this way, which incorporates these different aspects, brings them together. I think there's a couple more. I can go past those. There's one with shadow. There's the further down, I think it says apple. Oh, that was at the top. Apple with complementary shadow. So something like this is what some of the artists started doing was, you may not even be able to see it, but the complementary color to the red is green. And so they do it for a couple of reasons. One is that's actually what you see. And the other is that it really helps this, as opposed to those fruit in the bowl that didn't have that. You saw how flat that was. This one gives it its depth. And so it draws us in a little bit more. But that's what's going on optically, and it's something that's really hard to understand, but even just pure light shadows, if you shine a red light on something, in the shadow will be green. Why does that happen? So this kind of physics of light actually embodies a lot of this experience, and that's how we really interact with nature all the time. We're kind of seeing that. So something which is in light, reflecting light, but also then again this darkness. So this after image quality is there, the light and dark is there, this complementary color is there, all of that we skim over in seconds and instantly recognize that's going on. So we're doing this internal chemistry all the time. So the thesis was really to see, could we actually explore this further to actually use this as a method. So it doesn't have to be quantified. I don't need to use math. That was one of the other problems that Fitzgerald talked about. This mathematization, you could call it, of everything, turning everything into numbers, which are really abstractions. So math has its place. It's very useful. But we can talk about wavelengths and describe it that way, but what do wavelengths really tell us about this, other than that, well, this is green, this is red, this is yellow. So they're really this kind of abstraction which pulls us out of our experience. How do we engage our experience and connect it to nature rather than trying to separate ourselves and be objective. But this is something we could all agree on. We can all agree on that there is green there. We do see that. It's not subjective in the sense that some people see green, or some people see a red apple, and some are seeing a violet apple. We can agree on this. So in a certain sense, it is objective. These are things that we can have in common. We have this common experience of the natural phenomena that's going on. So my conclusion is, yes, you can work this way, very somewhat methodically, and say, can I approach this, see what are the different aspects, separate them out in my chemistry, then bring them back together. And so using the thinking, using the senses as these states of consciousness, really becoming aware of how we do that, actually experiencing those things. I think you could do this with other art forms. Phenomenologically, music could maybe be used that way, poetry, movement, other things which are really embodying our experience instead of being always separating out. I think the visual is a nice medium because it's easy to see. Very quickly we can kind of, oh yeah, we can agree on those things. How do you see this? We can share this a little more easily than a lot of other art forms. It's kind of in the middle, in between the form aspect and movement, all the way up to kind of verbal, poetic aspects. So that's the basis. There might have been a couple of others. If we see LSD, this black on what? There's another. White and blue on black, biomorphic. I want to know what's biomorphic. Biomorphic. Looking, hopefully it will become evident when you see it. That same life form. So somewhat abstract and somewhat not. So you could see that as porpoise or bird or whale, or it seems because of the roundedness quality or something. There's some of these forms, but so very lightly in some places, it just barely comes into form here. Here it comes more into form because of the interaction of light and dark. So that's part of the question in our vision, is how are we able to turn what we see, sensory information, instead of thinking of it as data, oh yes, and now I know it's this. How are we able to actually see something? And so here it becomes very vague, and like if I were to, if I really just cut this into right here, you'd say it's just a gray nothingness. But here you can start to see, oh, the form here of some sort. What it is not too clear. So even within this, even with a little bit of color, so there's some color interaction, and after images would arise from that, but at least you can start to see, oh, something arises because of this interaction of light and dark. And you could look at this with a prism, and certain colors would arise right here and here, anywhere there's an interaction of light and dark. And on that other level of things, you'd see color arise. So I'd like to explore more, do more of a series and actually get more, and a little more artistic and a little more engaged in the work. These are all a little sketchy, but they show something, and you can see it as a way of exploring what's going on in our vision and our visual fields to do that kind of work. Any questions?
I have one actually. In med school, I had a teacher who talked a lot about phenomenology, and I remember barely him mentioning something about how we don't actually see green. Did you come across that in any of the research? Because I don't have a basis for understanding what you meant by that.
No, I haven't actually heard that. Interesting.
So to piggyback on that, while I was thinking this, I recently read a study that describes that linguists are now believing that the only time that we can actually visually see a color is when we have a word to describe it. So yeah, they've used like the Iliad and the Aeneid to for their basis, because there's no color for blue. There's only, there's the sea is purple and the sky is green. So interesting.
Yeah.
Like our eyes somehow
Yeah,
connected
it
to
might
that.
be, it could be related to that phenomenon. But yeah, that's part of how our brains work, is
Yeah.
that there's different areas for different aspects of it. And so, you could even compare animals. There are, like a frog doesn't see a fly on the wall. Just doesn't register in its brain at all. So, but the moment it flies, boom, it sees it. But it has no context, because for them, flies are something moving. It's something flying. It's not. That's not a fly. That's just sitting here. So I'm not sure about the green. That'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, it was something, and I'm gonna completely murder this, so don't take my word on it, but that our brains and our eyes and the interaction of that information as we're receiving it is really our processes identifying it so that we can put it into categories. But we're not actually seeing the color green, we're seeing the reflection of other colors and calling it that mentally.
That's a little bit different, yeah. What's actually going on in the brain of, you're activating retina, and then that goes to other parts of the brain that then process it and turn it into other information.
Right.
And then there's even a concept part that goes with that as well.
Goethe also talks about, or expresses that continuing to practice observation in this way can really lead to the development of a new sense organ. What did you experience?
Well, yeah, some of this, if you start to really look at everything in a different way, and start to say, well, what am I really seeing here? What are the colors? That's part of why doing the art is actually good, because then you have to actually render it. So how would you see this? How would you see, because we don't see in black and white. Most people don't. Most people see color. And so if you were actually looking at everything just in terms of light and dark, how would you see this room that you're seeing right now? How would that be different? Because we're picking up on that, but we're always combining it with other stuff. So kind of separate that part out. Or what would the after image be of what we see right now? Because, see, most people think of after images as illusions. And so you can go, most books of illusions will have, the most famous one is, there's a black and white lithograph of Marilyn Monroe, and her lips are in green. So you stare at that, and you close your eyes, and you see Marilyn Monroe with red lips. So it's, they think that's an illusion. Well, it's not an illusion. You're actually seeing that. So that's your experience. But see, this is the same thing. We kind of separate everything else that we can't explain, or what's not normal. We say, oh, well, that's an illusion. It's not real. That's part of our vision all the time. Just we generally don't notice it. You may notice it if you wake up in the middle of the night and there's a bright light, and you see that very quickly, and then you close your eyes, and then you say, wow, I can still see the image of the window or whatever it was. So yeah, you are having that experience. That's our experience. So rather than say, no, that's not our experience, or that's an illusion, we should say, no, this is part of how we see this, part of how we interact with the world all the time. Yeah, so developing that greater sensitivity to what's going on in every case, to really see people's color. That's one of the myths about seeing people. Oh, these people are brown. What does that mean? Brown's such a vague term anyway, and no one's white, and no one's black. Everyone has this mix of color. What we really talked about is, you see all those variations, and really see more instead of these categories that we tend to put them in these mental constructs, which are concepts. And so rather than thinking of science as finding concepts, to find really what are laws, what are higher rules of things, or what's real knowledge. So Casarer is in my thesis a lot, because he really looked at what he called intuition. So how do we reach intuition? Not just a concept, but an actual idea. So how do you develop this intuition? Because that's really the higher aspect of that we're starting to see. Like can we develop our intuition through this process and really know something, really know that tree, and not just define it biochemically? How do we develop intuition? You might say it's really the goal. So can you become more of an intuitive investigator, researcher, and develop that intuition within ourselves?
Thank you
Mm-hmm.
very much. Yes, so this is all really compelling. You'll all be around this weekend. Feel free to
Yeah, we
Talk to
we
each
should have
other.
presented together.
You know, well, actually, what's interesting is this whole morning, we're gonna see these synchronicities in this, cluster of presentations. I'm just sitting here going, oh my God, wow.
It's
you know.
good planning.
Right. Yeah, so in 5 minutes,